Welcome to Real Estate I Love It podcast. I'm Shelley Hoffman, real estate expert and community advisor. Join me and various guests who are expert in what they do, such as home inspectors, mortgage brokers, investors, wholesalers. There are so many aspects to our industry that most people are not aware of, and I'm here to help you learn about them. I'm an educator by trade, and this podcast is to educate you in the world of real estate. Hey everybody, it's Shelley Hoffman with Real Estate I Love It, because if you know me, you know I talk about it nonstop and I do love it. And today I'm here with Steve Ladd. Steve Ladd and I both worked at Horan Companies very, very briefly, and then they gave me the boot, I'm pretty sure, even though they made it seem like it was my idea. But Steve, you're here today to talk a little bit about insurance and how it relates to the home buying process. So I appreciate your time. How are you doing?
I'm good. Thank you for having me today. I appreciate it.
Of course. I know we've talked about this a few times, and you're on Clubhouse with me on Monday mornings, and we talk a little bit about insurance. So I just asked you if you could come on today and share that knowledge with Facebook and YouTube, where this podcast plays. So
yes.
So first thing I want to talk about is, people are buying their home, they're looking at the market value. So when they call you and they say, this is the market value, that's not really how you look at the property, correct? You guys have a different way of assessing the insurance value.
Right. Yes. So the insurance carrier is going to look at the rebuild cost of the property with what it would cost in today's materials and today's labor to put the property back up to the way that it had been prior. And by what I mean by had been was as close to the existing form or style of the house that currently exists. So if it's a 3,000 square foot home, they want to put a 3,000 square foot home back in its place. So in order to do that, you have to value the home at what the cost is to repair or replace the home in full or in total in the event of a total loss. So that's a big part of it. And oftentimes the cost to rebuild the house is going to be higher than what it would be to buy the house. Although in today's market, that number is actually starting to get closer and closer together. It used to be a lot further apart. So we don't hear a lot of issues with people when it comes to like new purchases now, where it comes in a lot of times to say somebody who has had their house for a long time and they're like, you tell them what the cost would be to replace the replacement value would be. And they're like, I could never sell my house for that. Although that's starting to go away too, because now they're like, I could almost sell my house for that now in this market. But that's a big part of it. So, and then the reason why you have to be insured to that amount isn't because the insurance carrier is overwhelmingly concerned that it's going to be a total loss. And most people aren't like, I'm not really worried about my house burning all the way down to the ground necessarily. So how about if I just insure for less and then I'll just sort of take my chances, so to speak. Well, right. What happens is the insurance carrier says, no, it's we have to insure you at full value. Because it's in the insurance language that suggests that they have to do that. And if they don't do that, then any partial losses that you experience, which is usually going to be what it is, it's going to be water damage, it's going to be, some sort of wind issue that might occur, things like that, some sort of like physical structural damage to the property, but not a complete and total loss. Well, if you're not insured to value at least on a homeowner's policy to at least 100% most of the time, then any partial losses are going to be reduced by the difference. So if you should be insured for, let's say 100,000, but you're only insured for 70, well, that's 30% difference. So then the insurance carrier's obligation at that point is to say, all right, well, any partial loss, we're going to reduce by 30%. So if you have a $10,000 roof loss, we're only going to give you $7,000. And then we're going to take your deductible off of that. So that's another $1,000. So now you're down to $6,000. Once people start to understand that that's really where they're going to get hit the most if they underinsure, then and it's not any less expensive really to bother playing that game. So, we just put it where it's supposed to be and call it a day.
Meaning the amount of the policy doesn't really...
The premium. Yeah, it doesn't change much. It really doesn't. Homeowners insurance as a rule isn't all that expensive to begin with, in my opinion, for what you're getting. Yeah. So, if you're only at, say, $750 a year for a policy, how much lower really is it going to get? You still have all these other components to it: personal property, loss of use, liability, medical payments, sewer and water backup. The list goes on and on.
Right.
If we're focusing just on the value of the house, I mean, really, how much of that premium is really being dictated just by that particular piece of it? Part of it, but not all of it. So
Right.
if you get too, sort of too artistic, so to speak, with that part of it, you're not really going to impact the rest of the premium much. So might as well just make it be where it's supposed to be.
So I want to go back to a conversation you and I had when I was purchasing my last home, the one that I'm in now, which was built in the 1800s.
Yeah.
It has a lot of character. A lot of people in our community actually have been through this home because it's been on the market so many times. And when we were talking about that,
I was through that home. Yes.
You were through that home. So that was the nice piece, because when we were talking about how to insure it, you're like, oh, well, does it still have this, or what was that? But
Yep.
But the replacement, going back to the insurance value, and you said it goes by, let's say the house is 3,300 square feet and you're going to insure it. But like you said, for me to rebuild my home with all the quality or the traits and the characteristics of the 1800s, that was going to be a huge difference in the premium, correct?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. So when you get into the sort of older style homes, and you talk about yours, late 1800s, around that time. So anything late 1800s to, maybe around 1915, 1920 range, somewhere in there, you're going to find a lot of kind of higher, in a way, it is higher quality craftsmanship. It's not, they don't do things like now to the extent that they did them back then. Of course, they took a lot longer to build a house back then than they do now. So the amount of time and attention being paid to one particular property and the amount of detail that went into it is pretty significant compared to nowadays. And the ability to find the proper skilled labor to go in and replace any of those items is much more difficult. It's not impossible, it can be done, but the cost to do so is so much more significant than, say, just replacing a normal banister on a flight of stairs. And then you compare that to an older home, which may have a lot more going on from a detailed perspective in terms of the type of wood and the notches and the carve outs and all that stuff. So you got to have somebody come in who's, has some level of experience in that regard. So that changes the cost of the replacement cost on the house, because it's not just the materials, it's the labor that goes into it as well. So you can find, if you're saying like, look, I love my house, I love every little nook and cranny and piece to it, and I want it to come back just like the way it was before, then you could take what otherwise would be maybe like a $500,000 rebuild value, and you could be up over $1 million, depending on how much really would need to be redone. And then, but it's just really, it's up to the insured at that point to say, okay, I'm okay with that. I'm going to get a 3,000 square foot house put back. It's just not going to necessarily have all of these, little intricate features that really drew me to it, unless I decide to bump up the insurance value to it and get it back.
Yeah, I thought about making a petition in Baldwinsville to help me pay for that. Because could you imagine if anything happened to my house and I just built a modern day home in that classic corner? I might be the most disliked person in the
Yeah, that's true. It would change the outlook of that corner.
It definitely would. It definitely would. Though. But I love my house. But after, I do remember having that conversation and thinking, what is that? Because there's a lot of homes in Baldwinsville. Obviously, we're joking about mine, but there's a lot of homes in Baldwinsville and other parts of the central New York and the United States. There's homes you couldn't replace them, even with the same amount of the insurance to cover it. So I wouldn't make sure you understood that. You don't always get the same house.
You don't. And I think it's important that if anyone's watching this that does live in the village and has one of those homes, to really go back to their policy, and maybe even better yet, pull the policy out and contact the person or the company or the agency or whoever it was that was involved in writing it. And if you're concerned, go through it and ask the questions to them, and ask them to show you where in the policy that's covered, or that at least is referenced, because it might not be, honestly. Yeah. Because especially if it's like when you're purchasing the property, there's so much going on, and the level of attention being paid to the insurance policy is not usually all that detailed. Especially, I know I try to bring people into the conversation and take a deeper look at it, but honestly, it's very difficult to have them just sort of like relax for a minute with everything else going on and spend a lot of time looking at what it actually is that you're buying in terms of the insurance policy. Because everybody's just trying to get through, like, oh, the underwriter said I had to get an insurance policy. I have to pay the premium in full. They need a binder. Okay, can you do that for me? Yes, but let's also talk about what it is that you're paying in full for, and those numbers on the binder mean something. So let's get into a little bit of the details to make sure you're happy with the outcome in the event that you had a loss. Everybody looks at their insurance policy when there's a loss. Everybody. Okay.
Everybody.
Too late if it doesn't look good at that. So look at it before the loss. After the loss, it's like looking at your receipt. Like, oh, okay.
Mm-hmm. But that's that. Yeah, that's true. Because by the time you get to where people are calling you and talk about that process, there's so much. They're looking at furniture. They're looking at, the moving date, lining everything up. So the insurance at that point is, and people think it's just standard. Like you call, you get homeowners insurance. There's nothing, unique about it. But there really is. There's different. I've talked to you quite a bit about insurance on different properties because I like to move. So I learn something new each and every time, because even with myself being in the business, you get caught up into that piece. What would you say maybe the most common mistake people make that they realize later? Is it the replacement cost, or is there other pitfalls that they run into?
I think the most common mistake is not necessarily the replacement cost per se, because we do a pretty good job of getting that as close to where we think it should be as possible. So we kind of backstop them a little bit from making a decision that would be detrimental to them long term. But there's some other parts to it that I think can tend to pop up afterward, which would be things like, and just talking about the damage to the structure for a second, sewer and water backup is one of those things that is not part of the traditional standard homeowners policy. And even if you have like a non-standard one that has more bells and whistles to it, it's not going to cover as much as you might think unless you have it significantly endorsed. And that would be for like any damage to stuff coming through like a sump pump or a drain in the house, a floor drain, water that should be flowing away from the house that for some reason stops, changes direction, and flows back into the house. So sewage, anything like that, just general, not groundwater, municipal water may come back through. But those things can cause significant damage both to property and then the mitigation afterward. And a lot of policies either have no coverage, like zero, like there's just nothing there on it, or they'll have maybe $5,000 or 10,000, and maybe to 20. You'll find that those are going to be your common like levels that, and not every carrier even offers more than 5 or more than 10. It really depends. Some carriers let you go all the way up to the value of the house. Wow. I don't know why that would be necessary, but you could. Maybe you have a massive ranch that's all on one level. And yes, if something flooded bad enough through a drain and you were away for a week, I don't know, you could get up over $100,000 easy, with the damage that could be done.
Water does a ton of damage. It's crazy.
It does. It really does. So that's one part I would say that gets, often overlooked. And, I'll hear a lot of times you say, oh, I'm up on a hill, or, I'm, in a reason why this shouldn't necessarily affect them. But depending on where that blockage is, you might be on a hill, but if the blockage is further up that hill, it may not take much to turn direction and come back in. So it's not a lot of premium. If there was a loss and I would say, well, for about $40, let's say, I could have had at least $10,000 more dollars in coverage for you on this thing. No one would be blinking an eye at $40 when there was a $10,000 loss. So, and even if you went 8 years and never needed it, so what's that, $320? I mean,
are you showing your math skills, Steve?
I am. Yep. No long division today though. Thank you. But I will.
No, I won't put you on the spot with some long division.
Yeah.
But with that tables math, these kids do, they could probably just pop it right out of their heads. So, a lot of times we were talking before we went live about the reasons people start, especially their first home. And, maybe they're getting married, they're adding, their family's getting larger. But the other piece has to do with property. We talked about the structure of the home and ensuring the structure and the rebuild of the home, but the stuff that's in the home, correct? Is something that you talk to them about?
Yeah. So your personal property, otherwise known as coverage C on a homeowner's policy. I like to just tell people coverage C. Look at me like, what? Yeah. So, when us insurance nerds get together, that's how we talk to each other. It was, how's the coverage C? Oh, it was good, but the B was just in really rough shape. So we tried. Okay. So when you have, this is probably, in my opinion, this is sort of the weirdest pieces of a homeowner's policy, because You have the dwelling amount, which is put together based on all of the pieces that would go into rebuilding the house. So it comes up with this value. But then the personal property, all that is a percentage of whatever the dwelling amount is. It's completely arbitrary. So some carriers, minimum in New York, you'll get on a standard homeowner's policy, 50% of whatever the dwelling amount is. So if you have a $200,000 coverage amount for the dwelling, you got $100,000 in personal property. Others, depending on the way the policy is written or endorsed, it could be 70 or even 80% of the dwelling. But it's not a number that any one person sat down and said, well, I counted up all my stuff and I think the number should be this. Let's do that. It's not like that. And typically, and I've yet to run into a situation otherwise, especially with the values of the homes being higher as far as replacement is concerned, the amount of personal property is usually more than enough. You don't reduce it because it's not going to save you any money anyway. It's automatic. It's built in. You can add to it. That'll cost more premium, but nobody really tends to want to do that. So that's all the stuff in the house. So you think, okay, I'm good. More than, as what Steve just said, usually it's more than I even need. Okay, true. But that doesn't necessarily mean that every little thing within the house is covered at 100% per item. So you take things like you mentioned, like people are getting, maybe starting families or whatever, but maybe they were recently married and, they have engagement rings, wedding bands, that kind of stuff. Jewelry specifically, and I just did a video about this not too long ago, honing in on homeowners coverage and picking on jewelry a little bit because it tends to be an overlooked item. But if in the event of a theft of a ring or just forget it, like it was stolen, let's say, whether you're on vacation or wherever it was stolen, there's a cap on how much that's going to be covered for. And typically depends on the policy, it's either going to be $1,500 or $2,500. That's it. You're not getting any more than that unless you, and what's called schedule it on the property, on the policy. So you get an appraisal or you get a receipt from where the place was that you purchased it from. You're not talking significant documentation here, but you get some sort of note that shows what the value of the piece is. You can put that on the homeowner's policy. It's called scheduling an item. And that not only covers it to the amount that it should be covered for, that you would want to be reimbursed in the event of it being stolen, but it actually goes a step further and creates what's called an open peril level of coverage. So you could be on vacation and literally lose it in the ocean and just get out and call the carrier and say like, yeah, it fell off in the ocean. I lost it. And they'd say, okay, let's get this started for you then. It's open peril. So it covers you just couldn't find it. Now there's nothing else that you could point back to within the house and say, hey, I lost my, whatever, my coat, my television, my laptop computer. It's missing. I lost it. That stuff's not going to be covered, but these sort of things. So I'm saying jewelry right now, but it can be firearms, stamp collections, furs, art, it can be covered in a similar way. There's a few little intricacies there with the artwork, but the tone is the same in terms of how it's covered versus what would happen in the event that it was stolen from your house and you're capped at a very minimal amount.
So it sounds like it's the things that you would travel with anyway. You mentioned the jewelry because a lot of times we either wear it or we pack it for a special event, things like that.
Yeah.
Is there a benefit to, a lot of times people will take a video of all the possessions they have in their home for insurance reasons. If I was listening to you correctly, maybe I missed it, but if it's a percentage of the home value, is that important to do, is to take the video of everything so the insurance company knows what maybe went up in the fire or what was ruined by the flood? Yeah.
So most of the time, if there's a loss, and I've experienced folks who've had a fire, who've had a total loss fire, I've seen the look in their eye. I've seen where they're at that moment. And I can tell you this, they are, and remember, the insurance company's desire is to get you back to whole as soon as possible. So it is still smoldering, and the adjuster is already meeting with you to discuss what it was that you had and what you lost. And no one that I've met at that time has ever been in a situation where they are ready to start recalling exactly what they had all over their house. They're in a blur, they're in a fog. They're not necessarily ready to come through with, some list of coherent thoughts as it applies to all the personal possessions within their house. So while you don't necessarily need a video from or even a list from the standpoint of the insurer, because most insurance carriers they pretty much get it. Like, you probably had a toaster, you probably had a coffee maker, you probably had a blender, you probably had a couch and a chair and an entertainment center and a television and maybe a computer. Like, they know all that stuff, right? But what's helpful about the video, or even photographs that you store somewhere, not in the house, but is how it jogs your memory. So you can take a video of your kitchen and you'll see a drawer, and that drawer in the video will trigger something that reminds you, like, that's where the china was. That's where that's where I had, that's where we used to put, pick something else of value, that you didn't have on the initial list as you go down, and you're like, it's just not there. But that video helps to jog your memory. Maybe you even see stuff in the video, which is good, but it's not just the stuff you see, it's the stuff that you're reminded about that you wouldn't have even thought of had you not actually gone through the imagery at that point and reminded yourself.
That makes sense, because a lot of times you'll put things in a closet. So, if you're videotaping, even if you don't open the closet door, you know what you kept in that closet, those types of items.
Save it to the cloud. So whatever you take on, go up to the cloud. Cloud doesn't burn, right? The house burns.
I like how you said don't keep it in the house, because obviously you're keeping it.
Don't do that.
Don't do that. It could be in a fire safe box in the house, though.
Yes, you could. Although getting back to it afterward may take a little bit of time. Again, whenever possible, digitize it, email it to yourself, whatever, keep it simple. It doesn't have to be some crazy, cloud-based locked up fortress. You can just email it to yourself.
15 passcodes to get to.
Yeah, right. Yeah. Where are the passcodes? Well, they were written down. Where are they written down? In the house.
So when you talked about, when you were just talking about the personal property, what'd you call it? Coverage C, I believe, if I want to sound like an insurance.
Well
Thank
done.
you. I'm a fast learner personally.
Yeah, we might indoctrinate you. Okay.
But is that different than an umbrella policy? Because I remember that term being thrown around when we were working together.
Completely different policy. Probably good for another conversation another time. But yes, that's liability. That goes over all your other stuff that you have. So your auto policy, your homeowner's policy has liability on it. If you exhaust those and you've purchased an umbrella policy, then your umbrella policy can step in. Yeah.
Okay. I do remember now. I just wanted that definition for clarity, because in my head I was thinking it was personal, but you're right. It was the additional coverage, if I remember.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So there's a topic. You mentioned the real estate market a few times about how crazy it is. And one thing that might have been common in other parts of the country, but we really try to avoid it here in central New York, is when possible is pre and post possession. And I had this as a topic a couple weeks ago when we were talking on Clubhouse with the attorney. And I do have Christy coming on in 2 weeks, I think, to talk about it from an attorney standpoint. But can you share a little bit the risks that are involved, the liability that's involved from an insurance standpoint, if the closings are not lining up and you're purchasing a home and you would like to take pre-possession of the property? Because people don't think it's a big deal. They say, it's my stuff, we'll take care of the home. But it kind of is. They should at least be aware of the risks that are involved, correct?
Yeah. So let's talk about this first through the lens of the seller. All right. So the person who owns the property is granting permission to the buyer to take possession prior to its formal close. So the seller has left the property. The seller's homeowner's insurance should still be in force. So if you're the seller, don't cancel that. Keep that going. But you've moved out temporarily. And I guess what the average typically is usually less than 30 days for pre-possession. In fact, I think most of the time it's sometimes closer to a week or even a few days, depending. But the seller will say often, if they're being guided correctly, to make sure that the buyer has an insurance policy coming into the house. Okay. So most likely the buyer has already secured homeowner's insurance. However, there's one thing that the buyer isn't yet, and that is the homeowner. Yes. So they don't have an insurable interest in the home in the way that the insurance policy suggests that they have to. So that policy, for what it's made up of, is irrelevant at this point. So buyer moves into the house. The existing home policy isn't going to cover them that they've now purchased, going forward for their ownership of this new property. So what we end up doing at that point is writing a renter's insurance policy, which surprises people because, like, well, I'm not really a renter. Don't get caught up in the actual language of what it's titled as. Be more concerned about what it's actually providing, which is coverage for the possessions of the buyer up to whatever amount they want to pick. So the renter's policy is a little bit different than the home policy. You pick specifically what you want in personal property coverage. Now, most of the time, carriers are like, at least 10 grand. It starts there and it goes up from there. But if you're buying a house, you probably have more than $10,000 worth of contents that you're putting in it. But you pick it. So you get that. But from the seller's perspective, what you're getting and what they're going to care about is liability coverage built into the policy. So a renter's policy, or what's otherwise known as a tenant's policy, it's all the same thing. So that comes with liability. Again, you pick. It's going to start at $100,000. Seller may say, I want you to have 3 or 5 or $1 million, depends, whatever their requirements are. But that's going to be on there also. So in the event that someone comes over, so again, you're the seller, someone has come over to visit the buyer, to do whatever, to say hello, to stop by, whatever. So they come over and they get injured as a result of being there. Yeah. Normally, it would be the seller's liability coverage on their home policy that's going to respond for what had happened there, depending on the situation. The renter's policy now steps in front of the seller's insurance policy and begins to answer first. So that policy is the first and foremost level of defense for anything that may happen at the property that didn't happen to the buyer. Buyer having taken possession cannot come back against the seller within the confines of the liability insurance on the policy and take recourse. Okay, so we're just talking about someone else outside of the buyer and seller getting hurt at the seller's property because it's still the seller's property. All right. Depending on the scope of it, if it was really bad, the insurance on the renter's policy could be exhausted and then still end up falling over to the seller because ultimately the seller is still, in fact, the property owner. They have the insurable interest on the property. The reason why the seller wants to make sure they're carrying the homeowner's insurance still is that if there's a fire at the house or some other sort of loss, there needs to be insurance coverage to answer in order to fix that because the renter's policy isn't going to cover it and the liability has nothing to do with the structure. Right. So that even if it was the buyer left the candle burning, the house burned down, still the seller's home policy that's going to have to cover that. Okay, so they want to keep that in place for as long as possible. There's some details there. If it gets past 30 days or 60, you might want to have a conversation if you're the seller with your carrier and just say, hey, look, I'm not living there anymore. This was only supposed to be a few days. This is extended longer than I thought. Am I still okay to keep this policy the way it is, or do I need to rewrite it into something else?
Right.
Stay ahead of that stuff. It's worthwhile, believe me.
Right. Because you said it's not meant to be, even though the real estate contract says it's not, pre-possession would not be landlord tenant. It's not set up to be that way. It's kind of the relationship that's there. And the homeowner's policy, if I understand correctly, is not really, I know if you're an investor, you have landlord policies, you don't have homeowner's policy.
Right.
That is a scary part a little bit on the sellers because you are responsible for all of that, the structure and the properties, and you don't really know what the buyers are doing, just like in a tenant landlord situation.
Right.
So, and to your point, we are a state that has attorney. So with the attorneys being involved, I don't think they would allow a tenant to move in without the renters. And I don't think that a buyer's attorney, because you're going to talk about the buyers next, would let them move in if the homeowner's insurance policy was canceled. I would hope, because again,
right.
The attorneys cover all that.
Well, and just intuitively, it would tell me that if something happened at the house and the buyer hasn't closed on the house yet, and there was damage done to the house, if I'm the buyer, I'm like, well, I haven't closed. I don't officially own this thing yet. If I wanted to be real difficult about it, I could just be like, not my problem. And now you're left with an unsold damaged house that has to be sorted out. Keep the insurance in place all the way up until you are no longer the owner of the property. And if you want to be really extra careful, wait an extra day, then call. And just in case somebody then doesn't call you back from the attorney's office, say, whoops, something got missed. I don't know what happened, but we aren't technically officially closed until this document gets signed or notarized or whatever it might be. Worst case, you wait a week, you can still retroactively cancel the policy back to the date that you actually did close. So give yourself a buffer. I once had a person on the day of closing, she had a back deck, had a fire out on the deck as last time at the house, in one of those like bowl sort of fire pits.
Yeah, fire pit things. Yep.
Went to bed. It broke through the bottom. The smoldering wood hit the deck, burned the entire deck down. She woke up on the day of closing to a deck on fire. Neighbors pounding on the door and all that stuff. So when I tell you, keep the insurance in place until you are 100% done, and maybe then some, just to be sure. But trust me, I've seen it. I know what can happen.
Well, and for a little background on you, Steve, in case people didn't know, you used to be in real estate, just like I used to work in your office. So we have our conversations sometimes can overlap a little bit. You have way more knowledge about insurance than I do, but you do understand it from a real estate standpoint because you have done real estate in the past. I had somebody in Texas, to your point, the final walkthrough, the toilet had overflowed. Nobody was living in the home, but whoever had been there last used the restroom, left the house, locked everything up. And on the day of the final walkthrough, the upstairs toilet had overrun and flooded, delayed the closing until the homeowner's policy could come in, repair all the water damage, and then close. So
yeah,
it's definitely
critical.
Important to keep it.
Definitely.
Yep.
Yes.
From a buyer's standpoint, do you have anything to add if you're a buyer looking to do the pre-possession, or did it kind of cover?
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple of probably small things. So if you're a buyer and you are moving out of a house and you have an insurance policy already in place, you might be inclined to just keep that. And from your personal belongings, you could extend the coverage from the existing policy, and your belongings could be covered in the new house, including if maybe you're just storing them in the garage. Like that happens a lot of times. It's like, well, can I just move this stuff? I don't need to move me or my family in, but how about my stuff? Can I put it in the garage? I know that happens quite a bit, right? So if that happens, then the existing policy, make sure, just double check, but most of the time it will extend into the new property while it's being stored there, so to speak. Because the seller's policy is not going to cover your stuff in that garage. Those are not their belongings. That is the property of others. And if you're lucky, the policy was nice enough to bake in $1,000 for the property of others in your possession. But then one might even argue that, are they really even in your possession? But most likely the carrier would be like, we're not fighting that in court. Here's $1,000. Done. We're off the hook. So
for clarification, when you were talking, and I never thought about this before, if you're moving from location A to location B, mm-hmm. and something happens in the interim, there's an accident where your stuff goes flying, which coverage would that be? Is that what you're talking about, extending it, or is it the new policy? I never really thought about that, but when you're moving, especially if you're moving from New York to Florida or Florida to New York, mm-hmm. There is if you're using a moving company, they would have insurance. But if you're just in a U-Haul, you're driving down the road, how does your stuff get covered then? Yeah,
when your stuff's in transit, most of the time on a homeowner's policy, there's unless there's some specific exclusion that's been written in there. If you are the one doing it, like you didn't hire another company, like you said, you're using your own transportation method or whatever to move the stuff. And then there's damage done to it, because of a collision, car went off the road, skidded out on ice, whatever it might've been. If that's the case, keep whatever policy you have on your stuff should be the policy that will respond at that point. Okay. That's typically how that's going to work. The entire narrative changes when you're giving that to a moving company in terms of what their liability is and what it isn't. A lot of fine print there. That's not my world. So
for those of you listening in the podcast and not watching our faces, Steve made a couple of faces when he was talking about the read the fine print in moving companies, because we both have heard horror stories as far as things not being covered or repaired when they get to the other location. So there's great moving companies out there that take amazing good care and step up if there's damage. But like in every industry, there's good, bad, and the ugly. Right?
There are, yes.
Well, is there anything else, Steve? I mean, you've moved a few times. I know you don't enjoy it as much as I do, but is there anything else you can think of as far as how insurance relates to the real estate industry that a little tidbit of knowledge before we part ways today?
I think what you probably want to do if you're looking at a property and I know there's not a lot of time to make decisions right now in this market. Like if you see something you like, it's probably already been taken. Especially if there's a sign out. If they had enough time to put the sign on, it probably already sold. But if you do, maybe at another time, when the market changes, if it does or whatever, just don't be afraid to contact your agent. If you don't have one, call me. I'll help you. Get the quote ahead of time. Take some time to have the conversation. Listen, ask questions. You probably won't remember every little thing we discuss. Maybe you'll just remember that you felt pretty good about the conversation, and that's enough to make you feel secure in the event that something happened. You might not necessarily remember specifically what it is that's going to cover you, just that you remember feeling like you were pretty good after the conversation, so that when you make the call, you're not kind of, your heart is where it's supposed to be and not up here when you're about to make the phone call. Because I talk to people and I can hear it in their voice sometimes where they're just like, please, 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 please let it be covered, and because they don't know. And I think that's important. So take the time and, even if it's after closing, fine, call back and then sort out the details at that point. I know it's not super, super exciting, but it's worth it.
I don't know. You're bringing up policy or Schedule C's or policy C's and B's. I mean,
I got it all. I'll talk all day about it.
That terminology.
Yeah,
Steve.
we haven't even talked about coverage D, loss of use yet. And man, I will rock your world if I get into that.
A lucky lady when you come home and you talk shop. Let me tell you.
Oh yeah. Kids can't fall asleep, Steve. Go in and talk policy language to them.
Talk policy. To your point, though, when someone's coming in for a buyer's consultation, we are doing so much of it up front because the market's moving so fast. So we talk about that. We talk about have the conversation with your lender. I need to add that piece because I'll be honest, I haven't done that to call your insurance agent as well up front and have, and get some details. You don't have to have the house picked out yet. You don't have to know the property. You just need to know what you're going to be looking for. Yeah. So I will put that in my buyer's consultation just for you, Steve Ladd. I mean, I'll mention to them that you're around, but they might be working with somebody else, but that agent will thank you for that insight as well.
Yeah, I bet. Yep.
Oh shoot. Always a pleasure. I enjoy talking with you, whether it's talk shop or just Beeville in general. So I appreciate your time.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Likewise.
All right. Enjoy the rest of your day. And hopefully I'll be talking with you soon.
All right. Thanks, Shelley. Bye-bye.
Bye. That's it for this week's episode of Real Estate I Love It. Be sure to subscribe and leave a review on whatever stream platform you're using for your podcast. See you next time.